I want to give a shout out to Haley. She put together my title. Sean asked me last Wednesday night, I guess, Brian, you got a title? You want to do a? I was like, sure, we'll go with this. And anyway, she put it together for me, and I do appreciate that a lot. My only regret is I've changed slightly. Final years is probably a little bit of a stretch. It probably could have come up with a slightly better title had I put a little more thought into it. But here we are, and I do appreciate everything that Haley and Sean and others do to encourage me and to help me out. We are going to look at the last little bit of David's reign over Israel, particularly looking at, based off of what we discussed this morning, one of the punishments, one of the results of David's sin being God saying that your household is going to basically face the sword, that there's going to be conflict, that there is going to be turmoil throughout the rest of your reign. And it doesn't wait very long before it starts, okay? We're going to, similar to what I've done in other sermons in this series, where I'm going to talk about what has taken place and encourage you to go back and read the details yourself. This first bit, I will freely admit, I've been racking my brain for several weeks now trying to figure out how do I talk about these events between Amnon and Tamar in a way in which everyone can know enough about what's going on, but not get into too many details that perhaps some of the younger listeners might not be appropriate for them yet. So there's a very interesting thing right off the bat, chapter 13. So we looked at chapter 12 this morning. Chapter 13 enters immediately into this scenario that can only take place in a situation in which David, and maybe I should have, looking back at it, stressed more often how many different wives and things David had. But let's just call it a conflict arises within David's children because one of his children, I'll say takes advantage. We'll go with that. Those of you who are old enough and familiar with the story will know what I mean. Those of you too young, perhaps your parents can wait until appropriate time to explain that whole situation. But one of David's children takes advantage of one of his other children, and it's a half-sibling type of scenario. It's not a full siblings type of scenario, but it leads to this conflict that is going to lead to one of the major splits, one of the major issues that David has to deal with for the rest of his time as king. So what happens is there is one of his children likes his half-sister, takes advantage of her, and that daughter of David's, full brother, is not happy about the situation. I think we could all look at that and go, well, that's fair. Not particularly happy about it either. In fact, David is not, right? In chapter 13, verse 21, this is basically what it tells us about David's response to the whole situation. It says, when King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. Very angry. Awkward situation that David's in. It's a weird situation. And the description we get, what we know, is that David gets very angry. But Absalom, that is the full brother of Tamar, hated Amnon because of what he had done to his sister. But Absalom is a man of great patience. And so after chapter 13, or towards the end of chapter 13, the first half, chapter 13 is why Absalom is going to kill his half-brother, and then the last of it is what he does, how he does it. He waits several years. And this is a theme that you're going to see throughout Absalom's life. And the reason why we talk about it is because it has a very big impact on David's rule. It is a clear example of what God had promised would happen to David because of his sin. All right? And Absalom waits, I believe, 2 years. I should have memorized it more. The amount of times I listened to this, you'd think I'd have memorized. But I believe it's 2 years, waits, and then he has his opportunity. And he convinces David to go ahead and send all of his sons to go with him. And he kind of puts together this plot to kill his brother or half-brother who had taken advantage of his sister. And it all goes to plan for him. Kills his half-brother. At this event, one of the things that takes place is, right, all of David's sons have gone to this, and the first report that David gets is that all of his sons have been killed by his other son, by Absalom. And then David finds out, no, it's only the one. But because he has done this, Absalom has to flee. All right, and we're going to cover this because this is important. It leads to the conflict that arises in the kingdom of Israel and David's tenure as a king. He flees, and he is gone for several years. Gone for a while. He's gone because someone could seek vengeance on him for what he had done. And so he runs, he flees. And eventually, chapter 14 tells us about how David is convinced, I'll say, cajoled a little bit into allowing Absalom to come back. But he says to Absalom, you can come back, but you need to stay in your own household. You don't get to come face to face with the king. Okay, and so David's sons, and remember, these are David's children that all of this drama has taken place in. And David says to the son who had killed his other son, who had taken advantage of one of his daughters, and this whole twisted affair, and the son that is still alive, this one who had killed the other, he says, look, you can come back, but you cannot come face to face with me. And for several years, Absalom lives under this rule, this command of David's. But he is a person who is always planning, always thinking ahead. And Absalom begins this process by which he is going to try to take over the kingdom from David. And he begins it in an interesting way. One of the things that he does is that he goes out to the gate of the city. And he hangs out there, and as people are approaching this gate, they're coming to David. They're coming to David to solve the issues that are in their life, right? This complaint they have with a neighbor, a complaint they have with a friend, someone has wronged them in some way, and they're going to go to the king to get a ruling on what is going to take place here. And Absalom just hangs out at the gate, and he shakes hands with all of these men who have come to David, and he says, man, it would be great if David appoints someone to be the judge of this. So you'd have someone to talk to, and he's making FaceTime with everyone. Everyone that comes through, he's the Walmart greeter of the city, right? There at the gates, greeting everybody, being friendly to everybody with a plan. And he spends several years becoming a popular guy. And then he sets forth his plan. And his plan is, he says, David, I made a promise to God that if I ever got to come back, that I would go to Hebron, and there I would make a sacrifice to God because he let me come back. Let me do this. And David says, okay, go. And while he is out, Absalom, with a few of his friends, few of his buddies, they get together and they come up with this plan. And the plan is that basically he invites a certain amount of people to a gathering, and most of the people at this gathering have no clue what is about to take place. And essentially Absalom has them there declare that he is king. Remember, he spent years making himself popular with everybody. He spent years being at that gate trying to stand between the people and David. He spent years creating this conflict that is going to tear apart the kingdom. And what happens is that David ends up having to flee. In 2 Samuel chapter 15, I'll start in verse 13, and it says, "The messenger came to David, saying, 'The hearts of the men of Israel have gone after Absalom.' And David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, 'Arise and let us flee, or else there will be no escape for us from Absalom. Go quickly, lest he overtake us quickly and bring down ruin on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword.' And the king's servant said to the king, 'Behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king decides.' And so the king went out, and all his household after him. And the king left 10 concubines to keep the house. And the king went out, and all the people after him, and they halted at the last house." I wanted to read that because this is going to be a reminder of one of the things that Nathan said to David that was going to take place. Remember, part of the issue is David had taken the wife of Uriah, and he'd done all of these different things in secrecy. And God said, what's going to happen is your wives, your women are going to be taken by your neighbor, and it's going to be done in public. Everyone's going to see what is happening. And here's the beginning of that promise being kept. David leaves some of the women behind. And as he goes and he is left, Absalom comes in, and Absalom is trying to decide what to do. And so in chapter 16, verse 15, it says, "Now Absalom and all the people of the men of Israel came to Jerusalem, Ahithophel with him. And when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, Hushai said to Absalom, 'Long live the king, long live the king.' And Absalom said to Hushai, 'Is your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend?' And Hushai said to Absalom, 'No, for whom the Lord and this people and all the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain. And again, whom should I serve? Should it not be his son, as I have served your father? And so I will serve you.' Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, 'Give your counsel, what shall we do?' And he said to Absalom, 'Go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all of Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened.' And so they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel." See, God had made a promise. God had said, this is what is going to take place. The things that you did in secret are going to happen to you in public. Everyone's going to know. Everyone's going to see. And I mentioned that as a furtherance of this morning's sermon, this morning's lesson about the idea that even when our sin is forgiven or put aside, like David's was, consequences still come. And God had said, these are some of the consequences that are going to come, and this consequence has come, and it has come from His own Son. Now in chapter 18, we're going to read about kind of the end of this particular conflict. Beginning in verse 1, it says, "Then David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, 'I myself will also go with you.' But the men said, 'You shall not go out. For if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that you send us help from the city.' And the king said to them, 'Whatever seems best to you, I will do.' And so the king stood at the side of the gate, and while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands, and the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, 'Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom.' And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. I want to pause there real quick. This is one of those things, again, where the nature of David, that there's some interesting things that take place, right? Early on in his life, there were these opportunities when Saul was trying to kill him, and David said, I'm not going to touch Saul because he is God's anointed. And here you have a scenario where perhaps, I can understand to some point David's, it is one of David's sons, right? So there is that. But also, David knows what happened to Absalom's sister. He knows what kind of got the ball rolling on all of these different events. And so maybe he has some pity in his heart for that. But either way, what Absalom has done, Absalom has tried to take over the kingdom, has began a revolt, has taken over his household, has shamed David in front of all of Israel, and has gone out to battle to try to come and kill David. And David has his 3 generals, and he says, in the sight of his generals and all of the people who were able to hear him, he says, please look after Absalom. Deal gently with him. Right? Similar to how David had every reason to kill Saul, right? No one would have looked at David differently for killing Saul. No one would look at David and go, wow, I don't understand that, if he would have said, when you find Absalom, you make sure you take care of this problem now. What he has done to me, what he has done to this kingdom, what he has done to the people of Israel stops now. But his response is, go gently with him. He didn't want to see his son die. And I mention it because I think it's a very interesting story, because if you recall, all the people who, the two main events, right? When Saul is killed, the messenger comes and says, Saul is dead, and it kind of fudges the details a little bit about that story. What does David do to that messenger? Kills them. How can you lay your hand on God's anointed, right? When Saul's son is murdered by the 2 men and they bring the head of Saul's son to David, and they say, hey, look at this, we just ended this civil war, David kills them because they have done what is wrong. David says, look, this man was innocent. You had no reason to murder him that way. And so here, David has made a specific command, go gently, be gentle with my son. And then beginning in verse 9, we read about what happens to Absalom. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. And Absalom was riding on his mule. And the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. And his head caught fast in the oak. And he was suspended between heaven and earth. And while the mule that was under him went on. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. And Joab said to the man who told him, what? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there is nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. We get this image of the first person that dealing with these rebellions seems to have some wisdom about him. Seems to realize, nope, not worth striking down the enemy of David in this way, especially when David's made it abundantly clear that he does not desire it to happen. And so David's general hears, hey, he's literally hanging in a tree. The dude is stuck in a tree. Just hanging there. And this general says, why didn't you kill him? I would have given you silver. I would give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. And the dude says, had you handed me 1,000 pieces of silver, I wouldn't have done it. Why? Because that's a person who understands the concept that doesn't mean a whole lot to take a bunch of money to your death. All right, there's a dude who knew David and said, nope, not interested. Right? But what happens is Absalom ends up getting killed. David's general Joab looks at this and says, no, we're putting an end to this. And they do it in such a way where, as far as David is concerned, it seems that these men have limited their accountability for their actions. They command Absalom to be killed in such a way that there's no single person's really going to be able to be pointed out at as the one who did it, and let's take him off the ground. But remember this morning, God's conversation through Nathan with David, where he said, because you have betrayed me, you have put me to shame by taking your servant's wife. These are the things that are going to take place. Because you killed your servant, your house is going to be under the sword. And much of David's time as king after that is dealt with putting down rebellions like this one. Here, his own son is rebelling against him. His own son is trying to divide the kingdom. His own son has struck out against him. His own son, not just on a whim either, not just like, oh, the opportunity arose, I'm going to try to go ahead and take him over, right? But planned, methodically, waited patiently for the right opportunity and the right moment to try to strike at David, to try to get him and to end him. And I look at this and I say, isn't it interesting how God's promise to David is fulfilled? God told David these things would come to be, and they came to be. Chapter 19, David returns. It's interesting, actually. We'll skip back. We'll go back to the very end of chapter 18. Upon hearing about his son's death, in verse 33, it says, and the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. His son who rebelled against him, still his son. His son, whom, because of his actions, David had put, let's say, fences around their relationship. Because those were the consequences of the decisions that Absalom had made. In the end, when David hears about his death, he behaves like any of us would behave if we heard about the death of our child. Where we would all gladly give our life in their place. And he goes on in chapter 19 to deal with, first of all, some issues that come up from his reaction, right? Joab, his general, is not pleased that David is so openly mourning the death of his son, who again actively plotted to betray and try to kill and take over the kingdom, right? Joab says, man, this is an insult to all the people who went out and fought for you and died for you and made sure that this kingdom could be brought back. And so he had to deal with that. David ends up being, I'd say, merciful is perhaps a good word for some of the people who were against him. In chapter 20, he deals with another rebellion, this time a rebellion from a man who has basically said that because David originally right? The first 7 years as king during the Civil War period, right? He is over Judah. This man says, us in Israel has nothing to do with him because he's from Judah. We're like second-class citizens here. And so he starts a rebellion that David has to deal with. David deals with a bunch of different situations. In chapter 21, David has to make amends for some of the wrongs that Saul committed as king, where Saul had betrayed his word. God says, hey, you need to make amends for this. David again goes out to war. And then we get to 2 Samuel chapter 22. I'm going to be honest with you. One of the things that I've been doing to prepare for these sermons is I listen to an audio recording, audio ESV recording, someone reading this, and I'll listen to it on my way to work, in between, on breaks, those type of things, lunch period, I'm in high school, lunch break, right? And I say this because listening to someone else read chapter 22, it didn't seem like it was very much. I look at this and I think, I'm probably not going to go ahead and read this whole thing, which was my original plan. There's a lot in here. For the sake of time, I'll read just a little bit of it, and again, encourage you to go back for the details, because there's the general gist of David's message here, just by reading about half of it. But just going to encourage you guys, if you are someone who likes to listen to like audiobooks type of things, maybe invest in finding someone who does a good job reading the Bible, and you can spend some time doing that, and it's a neat way to help study. But 2 Samuel chapter 22, this entire chapter is basically David discussing being delivered from different troubling situations by God. We'll jump in verse 2, and it says, he said, "The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of my salvation, my stronghold and my refuge, my Savior, you save me from violence. I call upon the Lord, who is worthy to be praised. I am saved from my enemies. For the waves of death encompassed me, the torrents of destruction assailed me, the cords of Sheol entangled me, the snares of death confronted me. In my distress I called upon the Lord, my God I called. From this temple he heard my voice, and my cry came to his ears. Then the earth reeled and rocked, and the foundations of the heavens trembled and quaked, because he was angry. Smoke went up from his nostrils, and a devouring fire from his mouth. Glowing coals flamed forth from him, and he bowed the heavens and came down. Thick darkness was under his feet. He rode on a cherub and flew. He was seen on the wings of the wind. He made darkness around him his canopy. Thick clouds, a gathering of water. Out of the brightness before him, coals of fire flamed forth. The Lord thundered from heaven, and the Most High uttered his voice, and he sent out arrows and scattered them, lightning and routed them. Then the channels of the sea were seen, and the foundations of the world were laid bare at the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils. He sent from on high, he took me, he drew me out of many waters. He rescued me from my strong enemy, from those who hated me, for they were too mighty for me. They confronted me in the day of my calamity, but the Lord was my support. He brought me into a broad place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. The Lord dealt with me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands. He rewarded me. For I have kept the ways of the Lord and have not wickedly departed from my God. For all his rules were before me, and from his statutes I did not turn aside. I was blameless before him, and I kept myself from guilt. And the Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to my cleanness in his sight. With the merciful, you show merciful. You show yourself merciful. With the blameless man, you show yourself blameless. With the purified, you deal purely. With the crooked, you make yourself seem tortuous. You save a humble people, but your eyes are on the haughty to bring them down. For you are my lamp, O Lord, and my God lightens my darkness. For by you I can run against a troop, and by my God I can wall. This God His way is perfect. The word of the Lord proves true. He is a shield for all those who take refuge in him. When we think about David's life and we look at all of his life, we remember and we recall that throughout David's life, he does not always choose to do the thing that we know is right. Right? In David's younger years, there are situations where David reacts out of anger and is prepared to go and to slaughter people, and is lucky that someone comes along beside him and kind of steers him a different direction. Right? This morning we talked very clearly about David and Bathsheba, this fate of David falling and then David committing sin after sin after sin. We recognize in David a person who does not live perfectly, but we also recognize in David a person who constantly strives to correct, strives to return to God. And in chapter 22, we read about David saying, God is my shield. God is my refuge. That to the person who follows God, God is merciful and kind. To the person who is humble, to the people who are humble, God looks upon pleasantly. But to the person who is rebellious, God seems like someone who tortures. To the people who are proud, God looks to show them that they do not deserve to have that pride. Think about David's life. This morning we talked about the turning points and how there's this moment in David's life that kind of flips everything around for him. How even though his sin is dealt with, he deals with these consequences of his sin, and it leads to this tumultuous later part of his life as a ruler, as the king, where his own children are committing acts that we would look at, and if they were to take place today, all of us would say that that person deserves whatever the strongest punishment you can give them is. His own children are committing violence against each other. His own children are seeking to overthrow him. The people that he has ruled over are seeking to overthrow him, and he spends his later years in this period where he is constantly putting up with these conflicts, and it is the result, it is the continuation, it is the consequence of the sin that he had committed. And I say that for us to be encouraged that towards the end of his life, David could look back on his life and he could reflect and say that it is God who was the one who protected him. All right, the story that David that is most famous for, or at least if you're under a certain age, the story that always sticks out in your mind, David and Goliath, right? Who is it that David relies upon? It is God. Right? God has allowed me to do this. God has allowed me to fight the bear, the lion. God will allow me to defeat this person. When Saul is hunting him down, it is God that David relies upon. Why doesn't he kill Saul? Because he says, Saul is God's anointed. I will not go against God. I will not do it. When God has promised him a kingdom, and all he has to do is kill the man who is trying to kill him, he says, I will not do it because that is against God. I will not strike this man. When David is confronted with the sin in his life in chapters 11 and 12, David says, I have sinned, and deals with the consequences. When his son dies, David turns to God and worships God because David relies upon God for the strength to understand that that child is being taken care of. And that where that child has gone, David cannot bring that child back, but David will someday be there. In David's later life, when he is fighting against all of these people, again, a consequence of the mistakes that he has made in his own life, it is God that he counts on for the strength to get through those things. If we were to read all of the times in which David in the book of Psalms discusses how God is his strength, we would be here a lot longer than any of you want to be here listening to me. It is God which he relies upon. As we wrap up, as we look at the end of David's life, in 1 Kings chapter 2, as David is approaching the point in which he will die, he is talking to his son Solomon. And in chapter 2, the first 9 verses there is kind of a mix between David giving Solomon some advice and David dealing with some unfinished business, if you will. This last bit is kind of interesting there, where he deals with the unfinished business. But chapter 2, beginning verse 1 of 1 Kings. When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong, show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn, that the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Verses 5 through 9, there's the part where David, like I said, deals with some unfinished business. And it's interesting, but I just decided that if you want to read that on your own time. It's good stuff. But I think what we just read in chapter 2 there, verses 1 through 4, is worth reading again. Focus on the encouragement that he gives his son Solomon. Remember when we looked at the first part of chapter 22 there, how God was his refuge. When David's time to die drew near, he commanded Solomon his son, saying, I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. That the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness with all their heart and with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. Keep that in your mind for a second. We'll skip down to verse 10. And then David slept with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. And the time that David reigned over Israel was 40 years. He reigned 7 years in Hebron and 33 years in Jerusalem. And Solomon sat on the throne of David his father, and his kingdom was firmly established. At the end of David's life, as he is encouraging his son, directing his son, his encouragement to his son is, rely upon God. Trust in God. Follow His commandments. Follow His testimonies. Do what God has said to do. He says, if you do this, right, God will be able to keep His word to me that said, if your descendants, if your children follow me, if they watch closely the direction that they are going, then there will always be someone sitting on the throne. We know that this does not take place, right? We know that down the line, the kings of Israel refused to do what they were told to do. They refused to walk carefully where they were going. And the kingdom of Israel is destroyed, it is scattered, it is left to others to take over. When God gives us guidance, when God tells us the consequences of certain actions, if we learn nothing else from David and his life, it's that we can trust that those things will hold true. God tells Solomon, be a man, be a leader, be someone who follows God. There's a challenge there. I think it can be somewhat dangerous to draw direct connections between the earthly kingdom that God had established with the people of Israel and the kingdom of God, the church. But leaders within the church need to have the same attitude. Leaders within the church need to be able to be people who stand firm upon the Word of God, that keep His statutes, that put their trust in Him. We as Christians need to be that for our family. We as Christians need to understand that when we look at the Bible and the Bible tells us that, hey, parents, raise your children to know and to understand the Word of God, that is your responsibility, that if you do not do that, they will fall away. They will be led astray. We need to trust that God means what He says. And therefore, strengthen ourselves to be leaders in our households and to do the best we can to guide our children to know and to love God, to follow His commandments, to know His commandments, to know the wishes that God has for our lives. Again, David wasn't a perfect man. None of us in here as parents have been perfect. None of us will be perfect. But we, like David, can turn to God and say, I accept that there will be consequences for when I make mistakes, but I can trust in God to forgive my sins. We as Christians have a promise that is greater than any promise that was ever given to David. Because the promises that were given to the people before Jesus died on the cross, was buried and rose again, were promises about a thing that would take place. We have received promises about a thing that has taken place. That God is faithful to forgive our sins when we are faithful to Him. I want to end by challenging each and every one of us tonight to be people who take the encouragement that David gives to Solomon to heart. One last time, I really do like these verses. I am about to go the way of all the earth. Be strong and show yourself a man, and keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies, as it is written in the law of Moses, that you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. That the Lord may establish his word that he spoke concerning me, saying, if your sons pay close attention to their way, to walk before me in faithfulness, with all their heart, with all their soul, you shall not lack a man on the throne of Israel. God has delivered to us a better promise, a better hope. If there is anyone here this evening that is in the need to respond to that, if you have not been baptized, I want to encourage you to fix that now. Begin to step in the ways in which God has led us. If there is sin in your life that you need help dealing with, if there is something in your life that has been holding you back from following God, that you need someone else to help encourage you to do better, to get straight, to walk in the ways of God, if we can help you in any way, I invite you to come forward as we stand and we sing this song.